I want to start by telling you that I am not a dramatic person. I spent 41 years as a high school history teacher in a small town in western Pennsylvania, and if there's one thing 4 decades in a classroom teaches you, it's that most things that feel enormous in the moment eventually shrink down to their proper size when enough time passes. I've watched teenagers weep over broken hearts and failed exams, and I've watched those same teenagers, 10 years later, laugh about those same moments over beers at the class reunion. I learned early that perspective is a muscle, and I worked mine hard. So when I tell you what happened to me in the past 2 years, I want you to understand that I am not exaggerating. I'm not playing the victim. I'm not a man prone to self-pity or catastrophizing. I am a 74-year-old retired history teacher named Kelly Dugan, and I am telling you this because someone needs to say it out loud, and because I no longer have anything to lose by saying it. My daughter scheduled surgery on my body without asking me first. She didn't mention it to me until the forms were already signed, the date was already set, and the surgeon had already reviewed my file. She called it a gift. She called it life-saving. She said the doctor had told her it was urgent, that waiting was dangerous, that she'd done what any loving daughter would have done. She had tears in her eyes when she told me. She had her hand on my arm. She looked at me like I was something fragile, something that might shatter if she didn't hold it together by sheer force of will. And I sat there at her kitchen table, drinking the coffee she'd made for me, and I felt something in my chest that I didn't recognize at first. Something cold and heavy and very, very quiet. It took me a few days to name it. It was the feeling of being disappeared. Let me back up, because you need to understand who I am and how I got to this kitchen table in the first place. You need to understand what my life looked like before any of this started, because the before matters. The before is the whole point. My name is Kelly Dugan, and I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the third of 5 children born to Patrick and Marian Dugan, who were themselves the children of Irish immigrants who had come to this country with nothing but ambition and stubbornness, and a talent for working long hours without complaint. My father worked at a steel mill for 33 years. My mother raised 5 children and took in ironing from the neighbors and made sure we all went to Mass every Sunday without exception. We were not rich. We were not poor in the way that meant hunger, but we were poor in the way that meant my mother kept a running list on the refrigerator of things we couldn't afford that year, and we all learned early not to want too many things at once. I was the quiet one, my brother Michael was the funny one, and my brother Patrick Jr. was the handsome one, and my sisters Anne and Bridget were the smart ones who went on to become a nurse and an accountant respectively and made my mother very proud. I was the quiet one who read too many books and sat by himself and thought too much about things that were already decided and couldn't be changed. I was the one my mother worried about, privately, because she didn't understand me, and love and fear often travel together in families like mine. I fell in love with history in the 9th grade, in a classroom that smelled like chalk dust and old paper, taught by a man named Mr. Gallagher who wore the same brown corduroy jacket every single day and told us that the only way to understand the present was to refuse to look away from the past. I didn't know it at the time, but that single idea, that we owe the past our full attention, would become the organizing principle of my entire adult life. I went to Shippensburg University on a partial scholarship and worked summers in a grocery store loading dock to cover the rest. I graduated in 1972 with a degree in history and a secondary education certification and a head full of plans. I got a job at Franklin High School in Franklin, Pennsylvania, teaching American history and an elective course on the World Wars that I designed myself and was unreasonably proud of. I met my wife, Patricia, at a 4th of July party in 1973. She was a second-grade teacher from a town called Oil City, about 30 miles south, and she had red hair and green eyes and a laugh that I can still hear perfectly in my head if I close my eyes and try hard enough. We got married in 1975 in a church that doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down in 1998 to make room for a parking structure, and we bought a small house on Elk Street in Franklin that cost $32,000 and felt, in 1976, like the grandest thing either of us had ever owned. We had 3 children: Elena, born 1977, Marcus, born 1980, and Susan, born 1984, my youngest, who is the center of this story in ways I am still trying to understand without bitterness. Patricia died in 2019, 3 months before Christmas, from a stroke that came without warning and without any negotiation. She was 71 years old. She was healthy. She walked every morning and ate well and didn't smoke, and had been looking forward, genuinely looking forward, to the trip to Ireland we'd been planning for years, the trip we'd finally booked flights for, the trip that the stroke made into a folder of documents I still haven't been able to throw away. She died on a Tuesday. She was here on Monday, irritated at the news, telling me the garden needed attention, reminding me about the dentist appointment I'd forgotten to make. On Tuesday, she was gone. I don't have words for what that was like. I've never found them. 43 years of marriage, and then one morning you wake up, and the other half of the sentence is just missing. Everything you say from that point forward is just half a sentence, and you don't realize how much of your internal life was actually dialogue until the person you were talking to is no longer there. I spent the first year after Patricia died in a fog that I now recognize as grief, but that felt, at the time, simply like the correct response to reality. The world was gray. The days passed. I ate when I remembered to eat. My children called and visited and worried about me with varying degrees of intensity and frequency. Elena, my eldest, called every Sunday without fail and managed her worry with practical efficiency. She was an administrative director at a hospital in Pittsburgh, and she approached everything, including grief, with an organizational framework. Marcus lived in Seattle and called less often but sent long emails that showed he was thinking carefully about things. And Susan. Susan lived 40 minutes away, in Meadville, in a big house with her husband David and their 2 children, Caitlin and Josh. Susan had taken what she called an active role in my life after Patricia died, and I was grateful for it. I want you to understand that. I was genuinely grateful. The fog was real, and the house was empty, and having someone who showed up, physically showed up, to take me to doctor's appointments and sit across from me at restaurants and make sure I remembered to call about the furnace, it mattered. It helped. I told her so. I meant it. But somewhere in those first years after Patricia died, something shifted between Susan and me, and I didn't notice it happening because I was looking at it from the inside. It was like watching a river change course. If you stand beside it every day, you don't see the gradual erosion, the slow lean of the banks, the way the water begins to prefer a new path. You just look up one day, and the river is somewhere different than you remember it being. Susan stopped asking me things and started telling me things. I didn't notice it at first because, as I said, I was in the fog. When you're in the fog, it feels generous when someone makes decisions for you. It feels like care. It feels like being loved. And I was loved. I don't doubt that. I've never doubted that Susan loves me. But love and control are not as different as we'd like to believe, and sometimes the line between caring for someone and making someone invisible is drawn in invisible ink. She started small. She decided what days she'd take me to appointments. She decided what restaurants we'd go to when she took me to lunch. She decided, after one incident where I left a burner on overnight, one incident in 43 years of cooking without incident, that I needed a different kind of stove, a safer kind, and she replaced the stove in my kitchen while I was visiting Elena in Pittsburgh for a weekend. She just replaced it. And presented it to me as a fait accompli, a gift, something to be grateful for. I was not grateful, but I said I was grateful because she was standing in my kitchen with that look on her face. That particular look that said she had done something that required acknowledgement, and I did not have the energy to be the person who refused to acknowledge it. That was in 2021. I should have said something then. Looking back, I can see exactly where the path forked, and I can see exactly which fork I should have taken, and I took the other one because it was easier, because I was tired, because grief does something to your ability to fight for the small things, because I kept telling myself it was just a stove and Susan meant well, and picking this battle wasn't worth the cost. But every small concession is an investment in the next small concession, and the interest compounds. By 2022, I had found my footing again. The fog was lifting. I started sleeping better. I started finding things interesting again, the garden, books, a woodworking class I signed up for at the community center that I was terrible at and loved unreservedly. I reconnected with my friend Bill Terrence, who I'd known since the early 1980s and who had also lost his wife recently, and who met me for lunch every other Thursday at a diner called the Pioneer that served the best pie in Venango County. I started exercising again, walking in the mornings like Patricia had done, partially out of love for her, and partially because the doctor had suggested it, and partially because it turned out I genuinely enjoyed it. I felt, for the first time in 3 years, like myself again. It was around this time that I started noticing the friction with Susan in a clearer way, because I was no longer numb and the friction was still there. The replaced stove, the calendar she'd started keeping on her phone with all of my appointments and medications, which she insisted on managing. The habit she developed of calling my doctors directly before or after appointments to ask them questions she hadn't asked in front of me. I found out about this from my GP, Dr. Arnott, who mentioned once that he'd spoken to your daughter about this, before I'd had a chance to finish my own sentence about whatever this was. I told Susan that I'd prefer she didn't call my doctors without telling me. She said she was just trying to make sure I had all the information. I said I was capable of getting my own information. She gave me a long look that said she disagreed with this assessment and then said, "Of course you are, Dad," in the tone of voice that means exactly the opposite, and changed the subject. I tried again, more directly. I told her that I was still the one in charge of my own healthcare. I told her that I understood she was worried about me and I appreciated that, but that I was 72 years old and fully competent, and I needed her to be my daughter, not my manager. She cried. She said she was only trying to help. She said that after everything she'd been through watching her mother die so suddenly, she couldn't bear the thought of losing me too, and she just needed to know I was being looked after. She said it with such genuine anguish that I felt like a monster for having said anything at all. And so I backed down, again. I want to be clear about something. I understand why she does what she does. I'm not blind to her love. I'm not blind to her fear. I know what it cost her to watch her mother go so quickly and completely, and I know that fear of a second loss sits in her like a stone she carries everywhere. I know that control is her way of managing that fear, the same way other people drink or pray or run marathons. I understand all of this. Understanding why someone does something does not mean the thing they're doing is acceptable. This is something I failed to hold on to. Now we come to the summer of 2023, which is where this story really begins, if stories have a single beginning, which they don't, but bear with me. I had been having some discomfort in my left knee for about a year, the kind of dull, persistent ache that you develop a negotiated peace with when you're in your 70s, the kind you learn to accommodate the way you learn to accommodate bad weather or slow traffic, philosophically, with a certain fatalism. My GP, Dr. Arnott, had referred me to an orthopedic specialist named Dr. Holloway, who had done x-rays and told me I had moderate to severe arthritis in the knee and that I was a candidate for knee replacement surgery. I told him I wanted to think about it. This was honest. I wanted to think about it. Knee replacement surgery is not a trivial thing. The recovery is long and the rehab is significant, and there are risks, as there are risks with any surgery, and I had questions, many questions, about whether the improvement in my quality of life would justify the disruption and the risk and the recovery period. I'm not a person who makes large decisions quickly. I was a teacher for 41 years. I believe in doing the research. Dr. Holloway gave me some brochures and told me to come back when I'd made a decision. Here is what happened next. Over the course of approximately 6 weeks, Susan, somehow, through some combination of her calling his office directly and the particular medical culture that treats elderly patients, adult children, as essentially interchangeable with the patients themselves, had multiple conversations with Dr. Holloway's office about my case. I did not know this was happening. She told me later, when I confronted her about it, that she'd just wanted to understand the situation fully and that she had only been asking questions. She did not tell me at the time that she was having these conversations. She did not ask whether I would mind. She did not, at any point, say to me, "Dad, I've been talking to your doctor about your knee." What she did instead, one Sunday in August, was invite me to dinner. This was not unusual. I went to Susan's house for dinner regularly. Her husband David was a kind, quiet man who worked in finance and deferred to Susan on most things without apparent suffering. Their kids were mostly grown by then. Caitlin was 22 and in graduate school in Philadelphia. Josh was 19 and in his first year at Penn State. Sundays were sometimes just Susan and David, sometimes with one or both of the kids, always the same kitchen table with the same good food and the same feeling of being welcome. But that particular Sunday, there was a different quality to the air. I noticed it when I walked in. Susan was unusually bright, unusually cheerful, the kind of cheerful that has preparation behind it. There were flowers on the table, which was slightly unusual. She'd made my favorite meal, pot roast with the potatoes the way my mother used to make them, which was not unusual but felt, in retrospect, like a stage being set. David was quieter than usual. He kept glancing at Susan the way you glance at someone when you know something is about to happen. We ate, we talked about Josh's first weeks at school, about a book I'd been reading, about a trip David was taking for work. It was all pleasant and normal, and I was not thinking about anything in particular except that the pot roast was very good, and I was grateful, simply and quietly grateful, for the warmth of being in this house with these people. After dinner, after the plates were cleared and the coffee was made, Susan sat back down at the table and put her hands flat on it and looked at me with that specific look that I had come to associate with announcements, and she said, "Dad, I have some news about your knee." And I said, "What kind of news?" And she said, "I've been talking to Dr. Holloway and to a specialist in Pittsburgh, and I really think you should have the surgery. I've been doing a lot of research, and the longer you wait, the worse the outcome is likely to be. The arthritis is progressing, Dad. The window for a good recovery narrows every year." I said, "I know all of that, Susan. I've been talking to Dr. Holloway myself. I'm thinking about it." She said, I know you are, but I've gone ahead and here she paused, just briefly, the way you pause before you say something you know is going to land badly. "I've gone ahead and scheduled the surgery with Dr. Gareth Pulliam at Allegheny General. He's one of the best orthopedic surgeons in the state. The date is October 14th. The room was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear a car on the street outside. David was looking at his coffee cup. I said very carefully, "You scheduled surgery on my knee without asking me." She said, "I scheduled a consultation and a surgical date, yes. You can still, obviously you have the final say." "A surgical date," I said. "Yes. You scheduled a surgical date for surgery on my body." "Dad, without asking me." "I knew you'd say no," she said, and she said it so simply, so plainly, that it took a moment to register. "I knew if I asked you, you'd overthink it and talk yourself out of it, and your knee would keep getting worse, and then you'd need surgery anyway, but under worse conditions, with a worse outcome. I was trying to help you." I sat there for a moment. David still wasn't looking up. "You knew I'd say no," I said, "so you just made the decision for me." "Dad, please don't get upset. I did this because I love you. Dr. Pulliam is excellent. The date is October 14th. You don't have to, of course you can." "Can I said. And she looked at me with that mixture of love and frustration and certainty that I'd been watching her perfect for the past 4 years. And she said, "You're being difficult about this." I stood up from the table. I thanked her for dinner. I said goodnight to David, who finally looked up and gave me a look that I couldn't interpret and which I would think about many times in the weeks that followed. And I drove home. And I sat in my living room in the dark for a while without turning on any lights, and I tried to identify what I was feeling. That was when I named it, disappeared. Not angry, though I was angry. Not hurt, though I was hurt. The feeling underneath those feelings was something much more fundamental, a cold, clear sensation of having been subtracted from my own life. She had made a medical decision for me without asking me because she'd calculated, in advance, that my answer would be wrong. My answer, whatever I would have said, was already categorized as incorrect before I'd said it. I was already, in the logic of her love for me, someone whose judgment could not be trusted, whose autonomy was a formality rather than a fact, who needed to be handled. I was 73 years old. I had been a teacher for 41 years. I had bought a house and raised 3 children and buried a wife and survived the fog and come back from it, and I was fine. I was competent. I was present, and my daughter had decided, quietly and with the best of intentions, that I was no longer the final authority on my own body. I sat in the dark for a long time. Then I turned on the lights and got my laptop and started researching Dr. Gareth Pulliam. I want to be very clear about something before I go further. I am not a suspicious person. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I have no interest in the genre of story where dark forces conspire against the innocent, where villains lurk behind every institution, where the world is organized by hidden malevolence. I taught history for 41 years, and the thing history teaches you, if you pay attention, is that most bad things happen not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary accumulation of small moral failures, small choices made by people who weren't thinking hard enough about who they were becoming. What happened with Dr. Pulliam did not feel like conspiracy. It felt like something much more mundane and in some ways much more disturbing. It felt like a system that had stopped seeing me as a person. I looked Dr. Pulliam up. He was, as Susan had said, an excellent surgeon, highly rated, strong outcomes data, a position at Allegheny General that was clearly well regarded. I found no red flags in the obvious places: medical board records, malpractice history, patient reviews. He seemed genuinely skilled. This was not, I would come to understand, the problem. The problem was something I discovered when I read his review of my file notes, which Susan had forwarded to me in an email along with the surgery confirmation. She'd forwarded them matter-of-factly, as if sharing a document rather than acknowledging that she'd obtained them, that she'd had my medical records transferred to a new physician without my knowledge. The note said, "Patient has been informed of surgical option. Patient is undecided. Daughter has requested expedited scheduling. Proceeding on family request. Proceeding on family request." I read that line several times. Then I called Dr. Pulliam's office. It took 3 calls over 2 days to get someone who would actually discuss the case with me, and when I finally reached a nurse coordinator named Andrea, she was professionally pleasant and completely unhelpful. "I'd like to discuss my case," I said. "I'm Mr. Dugan, the surgical date that was scheduled for me on October 14th. "Of course, Mr. Dugan, how can I help you?" "I'd like to understand the medical rationale for proceeding with surgery at this time, rather than continuing to monitor the condition. I have questions about the risk-benefit analysis." A brief pause. "Those would be questions for the doctor." "I understand. Can I speak to the doctor?" "Dr. Pulliam is unavailable today. I can schedule you for a consultation." "The consultation, Susan, my daughter, scheduled, is on October 14th, which is also the surgery date. I'd like to speak to the doctor before that." Another pause. "I see. I can see if we can arrange a pre-consultation call." "That would be helpful. I have specific questions about my imaging results, about the progression rate of the arthritis, about alternative treatments, conservative management, physical therapy, and about the statistical outcomes data for my demographic." There was a different kind of pause this time. It's hard to describe, but I've been talking to people for 73 years, and I know what a pause sounds like when someone is recalibrating. "I'll pass that along to the doctor," she said. "We'll be in touch." They were not in touch. I called again 3 days later. I was told the doctor had reviewed my questions and felt they were best addressed at the consultation on October 14th. I called again a week later. I was told the same thing. On the 3rd call, I asked specifically, "Can someone explain to me what happens if I decide not to proceed with surgery on October 14th. What is the process for cancelling or rescheduling? The coordinator I spoke to this time was different. She said carefully, "Mr. Dugan, I do want to make sure you understand that your surgical spot has been reserved and that Dr. Pulliam's schedule is very full. If you cancel, the next available date would be quite a way out." "How far out?" "Probably 6 to 8 months. "I see," I said, "and my daughter arranged this slot specifically." "The referral came through your daughter, yes. Dr. Pulliam does make accommodation for family-initiated referrals in urgent situations." "Did someone assess this as urgent?" "Based on the file, yes, I believe so." "Who made that assessment?" A very long pause. "Mr. Dugan, I think these questions are really for the doctor." "I understand," I said, "but the doctor won't speak to me." "He'll speak to you at your consultation." "On October 14th. "Yes, when the surgery is scheduled." "Yes." I thanked her and hung up and sat at my kitchen table, my own kitchen table, in my own house, and tried to breathe through what I was feeling, which was something between fury and bewilderment and a strange, quiet resolve. Something was wrong, not in a dramatic, conspiratorial way. Something was wrong in the way that things go wrong in large systems when the individuals inside them stop paying attention to who they're serving. Someone along the chain, Dr. Holloway perhaps, or Dr. Pulliam's referral network, or the broader culture of that particular medical practice, had made a calculation, probably an unconscious one, that Susan was a more reliable source of information and decision-making than I was. That she was a better judge of my needs than I was. That the efficient path was to work with the daughter rather than the patient. This happens, I know it happens. I had read about it in the abstract, in newspaper articles about elder care and patient advocacy, but reading about a thing and sitting inside that thing are profoundly different experiences. I called Elena. Elena is the organized one, as I said. She is the one who made lists and kept schedules and ran a large, complicated institution with apparent ease. She is also the one who, of my 3 children, has always treated me most consistently as a full human being, probably because she works in healthcare and has spent her career thinking about what it means to honor patient dignity, and probably also because she is the least frightened of losing me, or at least the most practiced at containing that fear into something that doesn't spill onto the people around her. I explained the situation. There was silence on the phone. "She scheduled the surgery," Elena said, "not a question. She scheduled the surgical date, and the consultation is the same day. And the doctor won't talk to you beforehand. He'll talk to me at the consultation, they say, which is also the day of the surgery." "Dad," Elena said, and then stopped. "I know," I said. "She had no right to." "I know. She can't just." "I know, Ellie." A long pause. I could hear Elena thinking. The way I've been able to hear Elena think since she was 9 years old and working through a math problem. "What do you want to do?" she asked. And this question, this simple, direct, completely obvious question that Susan had never once asked me, made something loosen in my chest. Because Elena had asked it like it was the most natural thing in the world, which it was, which it absolutely was, and the fact that it felt so notable just showed me how far things had gone. "I want to talk to the doctor before I make any decision," I said. "I want to be the one who decides whether and when I have surgery, and I want to understand how this happened, how my daughter was able to schedule surgery on my body without my knowledge." "Okay," Elena said, "let me make some calls." Elena made calls. What she found was not comfortable. Over the next week, through a combination of her professional knowledge, her institutional connections, and a focused conversation with my GP Dr. Arnott, we assembled a picture of what had happened. Susan had approached Dr. Arnott's office approximately 3 months before the surgery was scheduled, presenting herself as my health proxy. She was not my health proxy. I had a healthcare proxy document, properly executed, that named Alina as my healthcare proxy in the event that I was incapacitated. I was not incapacitated. I had not designated Susan to make healthcare decisions for me. But she had presented herself to Dr. Arnott's office staff as managing my care, and they had. And this is where the system's failure lives. They had not checked. They had simply accepted her word for it, because she was confident and well-organized and spoke the language of medical coordination fluently, and because, I suspect, no one had stopped to think very hard about who the actual patient was in this scenario. Dr. Arnott, to his credit, was mortified when Alina brought this to his attention. He was not personally aware of the extent to which Susan had been given access to my records and information. It had happened through his office staff and through a combination of medical culture norms that, in practices with elderly patients, often extend significant deference to adult children without adequate verification. He apologized to me directly, in person, in a conversation that was uncomfortable for both of us. Dr. Holloway's referral to Dr. Pulliam had come through the standard referral process, but had been accompanied by a note from my daughter describing the situation as urgent and flagging her as the family contact who should be kept informed of progress. Dr. Pulliam had apparently accepted this framing without question. His practice had a well-developed system for family-coordinated care, designed, presumably, for patients who genuinely needed someone to coordinate their care, which I did not. I was not incapacitated. I was not incompetent. I was a 73-year-old man with a bad knee and a daughter who had decided, with love and certainty, that she knew better than I did what was good for me. The system had simply accommodated her. I spent a week after this sitting with information that made me feel things I didn't entirely know how to hold. Anger, yes. Betrayal, yes. But also something sadder and more complicated, a kind of grief for a version of my daughter that I now understood differently. Susan was not, in any conventional sense, a villain. She had not deceived these doctors for personal gain. She had not conspired to harm me. She was a frightened woman who loved her father and had convinced herself, completely sincerely, that her judgment about his welfare was superior to his own, and the medical system had validated that conviction without once asking the right question. The right question was, what does the patient want? Nobody had asked me that, not once. Not a single person in the chain of referrals and scheduling calls and coordinating communications had thought to call me, just me directly, without my daughter as an intermediary, and say, "Mr. Dugan, what do you want to do about your knee?" I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it matters. I am 74 years old. I am a retired educator with 41 years of experience. I own my home. I manage my own finances. I drive. I cook. I garden. I take a daily walk. I read 2 or 3 books a month. I have conversations about history and politics and literature that I believe are reasonably sophisticated. I am in the early stages of the kind of physical decline that comes to all of us if we live long enough. A bad knee, some elevated blood pressure, the standard deteriorations. But I am, by any reasonable measure, a fully functioning, autonomous adult human being. And the medical system, presented with a confident adult child who spoke the language of care coordination, had simply defaulted to her. I have thought about this a great deal since it happened. I have thought about what it means, for the individual and for the culture, when we stop treating elderly people as the primary authorities on their own lives. I have thought about the subtle and not so subtle ways that aging marks you as less credible, less capable, less real, as an agent of your own story. I have thought about the long, quiet erosion of standing that happens to old people in a culture that associates worth with productivity and productivity with youth. I have thought about how easy it is, if you love someone and you're afraid, to start treating that love as permission. These were not abstract thoughts. I was sitting in the middle of them. I was the person being managed. I was the person who had been scheduled for surgery as though I were a package to be rerouted, an appointment to be organized, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be consulted. And I had, somewhere along the way, allowed this to develop. I had conceded the stove. I had backed down from the conversation about calling my doctors. I had let Susan cry and felt like a monster and retreated. I had chosen the easy path over and over, and here was where the easy path had deposited me. I was done being deposited. I called Susan. This was a Saturday morning in mid-September, 3 weeks before the scheduled surgery date. I had given myself time, deliberately, to move through the initial anger into something cleaner and more precise. I had talked to Alina and to my friend Bill, and I had spent several long evenings in my garden with my hands in the dirt thinking about what I actually wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. I did not want to have a screaming fight. I am not a screaming fighter. I never was. Patricia and I, in 43 years, raised our voices at each other perhaps a handful of times, and each time it resolved nothing and we both felt worse, and we learned to do it differently. I did not want to humiliate Susan or strip her of her dignity. I did not want to damage what was between us beyond repair. But I needed to be very, very clear. She answered on the second ring, warm and slightly surprised. "Dad, what's going on?" "I need to talk to you about the surgery." A brief pause. "Okay, sure, what's on your mind?" "I want you to cancel it." Silence. "I want you to call Dr. Pulliam's office and cancel the October 14th surgical date. I want to do that today, if possible." "Dad." "I'm not saying I won't have surgery. I'm not saying the surgery isn't necessary. I'm saying I want to make that decision myself, on my own timeline, after I've had a proper consultation where I can ask my questions and get real answers. Dr. Pulliam is one of the best. I know he is. I've read his file. He may very well be the right surgeon, but the decision to have surgery on my body is my decision, Susan, not yours." "I know it's your decision, Dad, You scheduled it without asking me." "I was trying to." "You scheduled surgery on my body without asking me," I said again, because I needed her to hear it without the cushion of her intentions around it, and when I asked questions, the doctor didn't call me back, and I found out that you've been talking to my doctors for months without telling me. Dr. Arnott's office, Dr. Holloway, all of them. Another silence, a different kind of silence. "Dad." "I need you to hear me, Susan. I'm not asking for your medical advice. I'm not asking you to coordinate my care. I am not asking you to call my doctors or review my files or make appointments for me. I am telling you that I am still the person in charge of my own health. Do you understand that?" A very long pause. "I'm scared," she said. Her voice had dropped. The professional, competent voice had dropped, and what was underneath was something rawer and younger. "I know you are," I said. "I'm so scared of losing you, Dad. After Mom, I just can't." "I know," I said. "I understand. But being scared doesn't give you the right to make my decisions for me, no matter how much you love me." She was crying now. I could hear it. "I didn't mean. I know you didn't mean to take my autonomy away. I know you thought you were helping, but help that I don't ask for and don't want, and that takes decisions out of my hands is not help, Susan. It's control, and I need it to stop." The crying continued. I waited. "What do you need me to do?" she finally said, and she said it the way a person says something when they're really hearing it for the first time, when the understanding is just beginning to arrive. "I need you to cancel the surgery. I need you to stop calling my doctors without telling me. I need you to ask me before you make decisions about my life. And I need you to understand, actually understand, that I may make decisions you disagree with, and that's my right." A long silence. "Okay," she said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, I'll cancel the surgery, and I'll try, Dad, I'll really try." "I know you will," I said. We stayed on the phone for a while after that, talking more softly, the conflict starting to decompress. I told her that I wasn't angry in a lasting way, that I understood where she'd come from, that I loved her. She told me she was sorry in a way that felt real rather than defensive. David, apparently, had been trying to tell her the same thing I was telling her, which explained the look he'd given me at the dinner table. It was not a perfect conversation. There was too much left unsaid, too much territory that needed more than a single phone call to fully map, but something had shifted. She cancelled the surgery that afternoon. Here is what I learned in the weeks and months after this, when I had space to think about it without the immediate pressure of the scheduled surgical date. I should not have been surprised that Susan did what she did, not because it was acceptable, it wasn't, but because we had been building toward it for 4 years, in small increments, and I had been complicit in the building. Every time I backed down, every time I said thank you for something I hadn't asked for, every time I let her cry me out of a boundary, I was teaching her that my boundaries were negotiable. I was teaching her that persistence and tears and good intentions could override my stated preferences. I was teaching her that I didn't really mean it when I said I wanted to be in charge of my own life. We teach people how to treat us. This is not blame, it is observation. I was not wrong to have grief. I was not wrong to have needed help in that first year after Patricia died. But I had let the dynamic calcify in ways that served neither of us, and I had to own my part of that. I also learned something about the medical system that I did not know and that I think should be better known. The default assumptions baked into the way many practices handle elderly patients are not neutral. They are not benign. When a practice routinely treats an adult child's input as equivalent to or superior to the patient's own input, when it fails to verify proxy status, when it processes family-initiated referrals without confirming the patient's agreement, it is making a structural decision about whose judgment counts. And that structural decision has consequences for patients who are still fully capable of making their own choices. I went back and had a real conversation with Dr. Holloway without Susan in the room or on the phone and asked my questions. He answered them. We talked about the progression timeline, about conservative management options, about what the recovery would realistically look like, about the risks. It was a good conversation, the conversation I should have had months earlier. At the end of it, I told him I wanted to try an intensive physical therapy program for 3 months before making a final decision about surgery. He agreed that was reasonable. I started physical therapy in October, which is when the surgery had been scheduled. I went 3 times a week to a therapist named Diane, who was no-nonsense and rigorous and had very strong opinions about quadriceps strengthening. And at the end of 3 months, my knee was measurably better, not cured, not fixed, but better enough that I was walking without significant pain most days, and better enough that I could make a genuinely informed decision about whether to proceed with surgery from a position of real information rather than pressure. I have still not had the surgery. It's been 8 months. I may have it eventually, or I may not. What matters is that it will be my decision, made in my own time, based on information I gathered myself from doctors who spoke to me directly. That is not a small thing. But I promised you a 25,000-word story, and what I've told you so far is perhaps the spine of it, the medical story, the autonomy story, but it is not the whole of it. Because in the middle of all of this, while I was navigating the surgery and the confrontation with Susan and the phone calls to Alina and the sessions with Dr. Arnott, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with doctors and everything to do with who I am and who I was becoming. I was remembering things. The investigation, and I did think of it as an investigation, the way I'd always ask my students to investigate history rather than simply receive it. The investigation made me pull on threads. And when you pull on threads, in medicine as in history, you sometimes end up somewhere completely unexpected. The thread I pulled on first was the question of why the medical system had been so receptive to Susan's intervention in the first place. Beyond the general cultural disposition toward treating elderly patients as secondary authorities in their own care, there was something specific about my case. I went back through my records, which Dr. Arnott confirmed I was absolutely entitled to and which took 3 written requests and 2 weeks to obtain, which is its own commentary, and I found something that troubled me. In my records, in notes from an appointment in early 2022, there was a designation I had not been aware of. A notation made by one of Dr. Arnott's staff during an intake assessment that read, Patient demonstrates possible early cognitive changes. Family member daughter serving as primary contact for care coordination. Possible early cognitive changes. I read this sentence many times. I was not diagnosed with any cognitive condition. I had not been given any cognitive assessment that I was aware of, not formally. I had not been told that there was any concern about my cognition. But there, in my records, was a notation suggesting it, and that notation had apparently served, in the logic of the office, as justification for elevating Susan's status as a primary contact. I called Dr. Arnett's office and requested an appointment, and this time I was explicit. I wanted to discuss the notation in my records regarding cognitive changes, and I wanted a full explanation of what had prompted it, what it was based on, and what its implications were for my care. Dr. Arnett was, again, uncomfortable, but to his credit, he was honest. The notation had been made by his nurse, based on an observation during a 2022 routine appointment. The nurse had noted that I seemed somewhat distracted and had difficulty remembering one of my recent medication changes. This was, Dr. Arnett acknowledged, a very thin basis for a notation of that kind. He reviewed my case and confirmed that I had never been formally assessed for cognitive impairment, that there was no evidence in my record of any consistent pattern of cognitive change, and that the notation had been made, and he used this word himself, carelessly. He removed it from my record and documented the correction. But here is what I keep coming back to. It was there. It had been there for a year and a half. It had shaped, in ways that probably can't be fully traced, how people in that office interacted with me. It may well have shaped the receptivity to Susan's representation of herself as my care manager. It was, in all likelihood, one of the invisible links in the chain that led to a surgical date being scheduled on my body without my knowledge. A careless notation, a moment of inattention. The nurse probably spent 5 seconds writing it, and it had consequences. I'm not drawing a grand conclusion from this about sinister intent. The nurse was not malicious. Dr. Arnett was not negligent in any dramatic legal sense. The system was not actively persecuting me. What happened was much more ordinary and in some ways more frightening. The system had made an assumption based on thin evidence, and the assumption had calcified into record, and the record had shaped behavior, and nobody had paused to verify whether the assumption was true. The assumption was that I was less capable than I appeared, that my seeming distraction on one afternoon in 2022, an afternoon, incidentally, that I believe I can identify, that was approximately 6 weeks after the second anniversary of Patricia's death, when I was struggling, was evidence of something more lasting and more fundamental than grief. I had been grieving. They had notated it as cognitive change. This is not an uncommon misreading. I know this from having now read, extensively and with some anger, the medical literature on cognitive assessment in elderly patients and the ways in which depression, grief, fatigue, and anxiety can present in ways that are misinterpreted by clinicians without proper training. I know it from conversations with other retired people I've now talked to about this, people who have had their own versions of this experience, people who have found themselves navigating medical systems that quietly treated their age as a diagnosis. I am not a bitter person, but I am paying attention in ways I was not paying attention before, and what I'm seeing makes me feel things. In November of 2023, about 2 months after the confrontation with Susan and the cancelled surgery, I attended a community meeting at the local senior center, a meeting I would not normally have gone to, but which my friend Bill had dragged me to, because Bill was on the center's advisory board and they needed bodies in the room to justify their budget to the town council. I went grudgingly, expecting to be bored. I was not bored. The meeting was about a proposed change to how the center processed medical referrals for its members. The county health authority had suggested a new protocol in which the center would, in partnership with local medical practices, help connect members with family support resources as part of their care coordination. The proposal was presented as an enhancement to member services. It was presented warmly by a woman named Carla who clearly believed in what she was describing, and most of the people in the room nodded along because the language of care and support is hard to argue with without sounding cruel. But sitting in that room, I heard it differently than I would have heard it 6 months earlier. I heard a system designed to normalize the involvement of family members in the medical care of elderly adults, without building in meaningful mechanisms for the elderly adults themselves to direct or limit that involvement. I raised my hand. I asked what protections existed in the proposed protocol to ensure that senior center members who did not wish to have family members involved in their care coordination could opt out. I asked whether there was a process for verifying that family members presenting themselves as care managers actually had legal authority to act in that capacity. I asked what training the staff involved in the referral process would have in recognizing and protecting patient autonomy. The room was very quiet. Carla looked at me with an expression that I recognized, the expression of someone who has not been asked these questions before and is not entirely sure they're welcome. "Those are very good questions," she said. "Thank you, I'd like answers to them." She did not have answers. She said she would need to bring these questions back to the planning committee. She said the protocol was in early stages and that member feedback was valuable. She said all of the right things. But after the meeting, something unexpected happened. A woman I didn't know came and found me in the parking lot. She was perhaps 60, maybe 65, with short gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested she had spent a long time being taken seriously in professional contexts. She introduced herself as Dr. Marguerite Holt, and she said she was a geriatric psychiatrist who had retired from clinical practice 2 years earlier and was now doing advocacy work. She said those were exactly the right questions. I said I have some personal experience with why they matter. She said, "Would you be willing to tell me about it?" So I told her, standing in the parking lot in the November cold, I told her the outline of what I've told you, the surgery, the records, the notation, the systemic deference to Susan's self-appointed authority. She listened without interrupting. She had the quality of attention I have always associated with the best kind of listener. She was entirely present. She didn't rush to offer framework or consolation. She just listened. When I finished, she said, "What you're describing is not unusual. That's what makes it important." She told me she was part of a small working group that was documenting cases of what she called proxy creep, her term for the phenomenon in which family members of elderly patients gradually absorb decision-making authority that the patients themselves have not ceded, often with the tacit or explicit support of medical systems that have insufficient protections for patient autonomy. She said that the problem was widespread and poorly understood, and that the medical and legal literature on it was inadequate to the scale of the phenomenon. She asked if I would be willing to share my experience with her working group. I said I would. I said yes because I am a teacher, and teachers believe in the usefulness of particular cases for illuminating general principles. I said yes because I was angry in a way that needed somewhere productive to go. And I said yes because Dr. Holt had looked at me and listened to me and taken me seriously in a way that I realized, been starving for. That was the beginning of something I did not anticipate. Over the winter of 2023 into 2024, I met regularly with Dr. Holt's working group, which was a loose coalition of geriatric specialists, patient advocates, healthcare lawyers, and this was the part I found most valuable, other elderly patients who had experienced variations of what I had experienced. We met monthly, sometimes in a conference room at the University Medical Center where one of the physicians had an affiliation, sometimes at Dr. Holt's home, which was the kind of house that collected books the way other houses collect furniture, tall and slightly chaotic and deeply comfortable. I met people I would not otherwise have met. I met a 78-year-old woman named Constance who had had her driver's license successfully challenged by her son without her knowledge, based on a letter her son had persuaded her GP to write, and who had spent 18 months fighting to get it back, and who drove herself to every meeting to make a point. I met a man named Harold, 82, whose adult children had, through a combination of medical and legal maneuvering he was still not entirely clear on, obtained guardianship over his finances while he was recovering from a hip surgery, and who was now fighting that guardianship in court with the assistance of an elder law attorney. I met a woman named Rosa, 70, who had been moved out of her apartment and into an assisted living facility by her 3 daughters who had collectively decided she could no longer live alone, despite the fact that Rosa's only issue was a controlled diabetic condition and mild arthritis, and who had eventually moved back out of the facility through sheer determination and the help of a legal aid organization. These were not dramatic stories of outright elder abuse. There was no one being locked in rooms or deprived of food or screamed at. The people doing the controlling in each of these cases were in almost every instance motivated by genuine love and genuine fear. They had all convinced themselves that they were acting in the best interests of the person they were restricting. They were all confident that their judgment was superior to the judgment of the person they were overriding. What they had all done was remove a person from the center of their own life. I taught a unit every year on the history of American law and civil rights, and there was always a moment in that unit where we talked about the difference between having rights in theory and having rights in practice. The gap between those two things is where most of the interesting history lives. The gap between formally acknowledged autonomy and genuinely experienced autonomy is where elderly people, I was learning, often live, technically sovereign, practically subject. I was also learning, from Dr. Holt and from the others in the group, about the structural factors that made this gap possible. The medical culture that defaulted to family, the legal frameworks around healthcare proxies and guardianship that were designed for people who genuinely needed support and that were too easily invoked against people who didn't. The ways in which ageist assumptions that older people are confused, that they make poor decisions, that they can't be trusted with their own health, were encoded in practices and systems that had never been critically examined. This was not a comfortable education. It was the kind of education that changes how you move through the world, that makes familiar situations look different, that makes certain ordinary interactions suddenly visible as something they always were, but that you were only now equipped to name. I started paying attention differently. I started noticing, in waiting rooms and pharmacies and at the senior center and in conversations with friends, the 1,000 small moments where elderly people were spoken to as though they weren't entirely there, where doctors addressed adult children rather than patients, where service workers simplified their language condescendingly, where assumptions were made about what someone at 73 or 78 or 82 could understand or handle or decide. And I started talking about it. I am a teacher, talking is what I do. I started at the senior center, which, after the meeting in November, had reached back out to ask for my input on their revised protocol proposal. I gave them input. I sat on the advisory committee. I helped them develop language for the protocol that explicitly preserved patient primacy, that built in verification processes for proxy status, that created a clear opt-out mechanism for any member who did not wish family coordination to be part of their care plan. It was not dramatic work. It was the kind of work that happens in committee rooms with insufficient lighting and weak coffee. But I showed up and I paid attention and I said the things that needed saying, and slowly, over the course of several months, the protocol got better. I also started, at Dr. Holt's suggestion, writing things down. Writing things down was not new to me. I had kept a journal, intermittently, for most of my adult life, and had written extensively in the years after Patricia died, dark and tangled pages that I've never gone back to read. But what Dr. Holt was suggesting was something different, a record of my experience with my medical care, written clearly and specifically, not as therapy, but as documentation. There may come a time, she said, when you need this documentation for legal purposes, for advocacy purposes, or simply to have the record clear in your own mind. She was right about all of those reasons, and one more she hadn't mentioned. Writing things down clarified them. Putting the experience into language forced a kind of precision that memory alone didn't require. It made me see the shape of things more clearly. I wrote about the stove and the pattern of small concessions that had preceded it. I wrote about the first time Susan called Dr. Arnott without telling me, and the first time I noticed it and didn't say anything. I wrote about the Sunday dinner and the pot roast, and the sound of Susan's voice when she said she knew I'd say no. I wrote about the phone calls to Dr. Pulliam's office, and the notation in my records, and the conversation with Alina where she'd asked me what I wanted. I wrote about sitting in the parking lot in the November cold with Dr. Holt and feeling, for the first time in a long time, that someone was taking me seriously. I wrote about Patricia. I wrote about what it had been like to navigate the medical system in the year after she died, disoriented and foggy and desperately grateful for whoever would help me. I wrote about how that gratitude, which was real and justified, had become, without my noticing, a habit of deference. And I wrote about how deference and love can look identical from the outside and feel very different from the inside. I wrote about what it felt like to be 73, then 74. I wrote about the strange social experience of aging in a culture that treats age as progressive incapacity, the way people start speaking more slowly to you, the way conversations shift subtly so that you're slightly more often talked about and slightly less often talked to. I wrote about the daily micro-adjustments you make, accommodating the adjusted expectations of the world around you, the way you learn to smile at the assumption rather than challenge it, because challenging it every single time would be exhausting. I wrote about my teaching and about the history of autonomy and dignity in American law and culture, and about the particular irony of spending 41 years teaching young people to think critically about systems of power, and then finding myself inside one of those systems being flattened by it. And I wrote about forgiveness, which I was working on. Forgiveness of Susan was not a simple thing. It is not a simple thing. She is my daughter and I love her, and she scared me, and she was wrong, and I understand why she did it, and I am still working through all of it simultaneously, the way you work through something that is not going to resolve cleanly into a single feeling. We had more conversations after the phone call in September. Some of them were difficult. In one conversation, she said something that lodged itself in me. She said that she'd watched me disappear in the year after Patricia died, that she'd watched me shrink down into myself and go gray, and that she'd been so frightened by it that she'd built a whole system around making sure it didn't happen again. She said she'd built the system carefully, logically, out of pure love, without ever stopping to think about whether the person at the center of the system had consented to being at the center of it. "I made you an object," she said. "That's what I did. I loved you so much I turned you into an object." I thought about that for a long time. She had made me an object of care, which sounds like a paradox but isn't. Care that doesn't ask what the person being cared for wants is not, in some fundamental sense, care for that person. It is care for the caregiver's own fear, their own grief, their own need to feel that they are doing something. I told her that I understood. I told her that I wasn't going to pretend it didn't happen or that it was fine when it wasn't. But I told her that I didn't want to lose her and that I believed she could do better and that I was willing to work towards something different. She is working, I can see it. The calls to my doctors have stopped as far as I know. The decisions have stopped being made without my input. When I saw Dr. Holloway again in January, she asked if she could come, not to speak for me or manage anything, but just to be there, the way you're there for someone you love. I said yes. She sat beside me and asked one question that I asked her to ask, and then she was quiet, and that was exactly right. There are still moments when I see her restraining herself, a flash of something in her face when I describe something she doesn't agree with, a pause that used to precede and override the ghost of the habit. But she restrains herself, and that matters. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my son Marcus over Christmas. Marcus lives in Seattle, as I've said, and works in environmental consulting. He is the child I know least well, in some ways, not because we don't love each other, but because we have spent our adult lives in different places with different concerns, and our relationship has always been conducted at a slight distance, warm and sincere, but geographically and temperamentally kept from the kind of daily intimacy I have with Alina and Susan. He is the middle child, born 1980, and if middle children carry something, some particular mixture of independence and slight detachment. Marcus has it. He flew home for Christmas that year, which he doesn't always do. His wife Jana was with him, and they stayed at Susan's, which is where we all gathered on Christmas Day, which was its own kind of test given everything that had happened. But it went well, carefully, deliberately well, everyone putting their best foot forward, the children making noise, and the food being good, and the fire being on. After dinner, after the children had gone to bed, and David had fallen asleep on the couch, and Susan and Jana were in the kitchen, Marcus and I sat by the fire with our drinks, and had a conversation that surprised me. He said, "I knew this was happening." I looked at him. "Not this specifically," he said, "not the surgery, but the direction of it. The way Susan was relating to you, I've been watching it for a while." "You didn't say anything." "No," he said. He paused. "I was afraid of two things. I was afraid of being wrong, because Susan is very certain, and certainty is convincing, and what do I know, living out there, not seeing it directly. And I was afraid of being right." Afraid of being right. If I was right, then I had to do something about it, and he stopped and looked at his glass. "I didn't want the fight. I'm not proud of that." I thought about all the times I hadn't wanted the fight either. "I understand," I said. "What I kept telling myself was that you'd handle it, that you'd push back when you needed to, that it wasn't my place to interfere." He paused again. "But it occurred to me, after you told Alina what happened, and Alina told me, it occurred to me that I'd used, 'it's not my place to interfere,' as a way of not seeing what was in front of me. I decided that respecting your autonomy meant not making waves, when actually what you needed was someone who'd call it out." This was a more sophisticated insight than I was ready for from Marcus, who I had perhaps underestimated in the ways you underestimate middle children. "You couldn't have known how far it went," I said. "Maybe not, but I knew something was off, and I chose not to know." We sat with that for a while. "What would you have wanted me to do?" he asked. I thought about it. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm not sure there was a clear intervention point. What Susan was doing wasn't obviously wrong from the outside, especially if you weren't nearby. It looked like care. It was care in intention. But care without consent is control, and control exercised by someone who loves you is still control." He nodded slowly. "I think I've been learning that in my marriage too," he said, with a slight smile. Jana, who is a brilliant and very organized woman, had apparently had her own version of this learning curve, though that's her story to tell, not mine. We talked for a long time by that fire, about Patricia and how her death had changed the family's center of gravity in ways nobody had mapped, about the unexamined dynamics of the parent-child relationship as it evolves, the invisible transition point where the child starts worrying about the parent the way the parent once worried about the child, and how that transition happens unevenly and rarely openly, and how it can go sideways in exactly the ways it had gone sideways with Susan. About what it meant, at 74, to insist on your own full personhood in a culture that was slowly revising your standing downward. At one point Marcus said, "I keep thinking about Grandpa." My father, Patrick Dugan Sr., who had died in 1991 at the age of 77, 3 years after a stroke that had diminished him significantly. I had watched my father in those 3 years, had watched a strong, stubborn, dignified man be steadily erased by a combination of the stroke's effects and the family's grief about those effects, watched him be treated, by people who loved him and meant him no harm, as though he were already more gone than he was. I had watched my mother make decisions for him without asking, watched my siblings handle him rather than talk to him, watched the man I'd known all my life become, in the family's management of his decline, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be lived with. I had told myself I would never do that to someone, and here I was, on the receiving end of exactly that, and what I realized, thinking about Marcus's comment, was that the pattern was older than I'd known. That Susan had learned something from watching us with my father, had absorbed, without meaning to, a model of how you handle agging people that was itself already flawed, already missing the person at the center. "We did that to him," I said, "your grandfather." "I thought about that," Marcus said. I thought about you telling me about him, how it bothered you. And I still walked right into it from the other direction. Not by doing it, I had never done to my father what Susan had done to me, but by not doing enough to prevent it, by not insisting enough then on his full standing, by accepting, as a young man, the family's logic about what he needed and how to provide it, without asking him what he wanted. We are all inside the same long story. The patterns don't die, they just change hands. Spring came, I kept going to physical therapy, my knee kept improving, I kept going to the working group meetings with Dr. Holt, and the work kept getting more interesting, more complex, more useful. I started to think, tentatively, because I am not by nature an activist, I am by nature a teacher, about ways to bring what I was learning into a broader conversation. Dr. Holt had a connection to a patient advocacy organization in Pittsburgh, a nonprofit that focused on elder care rights. In the spring of 2024, she arranged for me to speak at one of their community forums, a small event held on a Saturday afternoon at a community center, attended by perhaps 50 people, a mix of elderly individuals, adult children, healthcare workers, and a few lawyers. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous in front of an audience in 40 years. Teaching is different from advocacy. Teaching, you have authority by position, and the students are there because they're required to be, and the transaction is established. At this forum, I was just a person with a story asking strangers to receive it. I spoke for about 20 minutes. I told them what I've told you, the surgery, the records, the notation, the confrontation with Susan, the parking lot with Dr. Holt. I told it plainly, without melodrama, the way I'd been trained to present evidence to skeptical teenagers. I told them what I'd learned from the working group, about proxy creep and structural ageism and the gap between formal and practical autonomy. And I told them what I thought mattered about it, not that family members are villains, not that doctors are malicious, but that systems create defaults, and defaults create outcomes, and the outcomes are not always visible to the people inside the systems. When I finished, there was a silence, and then there was applause which surprised me. More than the applause, what stayed with me were the conversations afterward. A woman, she must have been 75, maybe 80, with beautiful silver hair and a careful expression, came and took my hand and said, "My son did exactly what your daughter did. He calls it helping, I call it drowning." A man of perhaps 65, clearly there in his role as a son rather than a patient, stood for a long time looking like he was working something out. He finally said to me, "My mother has been telling me for 2 years that she doesn't want to move closer to me. I keep thinking she doesn't understand what's good for her." He paused. "I don't know why I just said that to a stranger." "Because you already knew it," I said. He nodded slowly and went away. A nurse, young, maybe 30, came up and said she'd been dealing with families who overrode patients her whole career, and that she'd been trained to defer to the families and had never once been explicitly told that this practice was ethically fraught. She said, "I'm going to think about this differently now. This is why you tell stories, not to be right, not even primarily to be heard, but because the story you tell gives the people listening permission to recognize something they were already looking at without seeing. I am a teacher. This is the only thing I've ever been, underneath all the other things. Everything I have done in the past year, the confrontation with Susan, the working group meetings, the forum talk, the writing, is teaching. It is me doing the only thing I know how to do with something I've learned, turning it into language, placing it in front of other people, and trusting them to do something with it. I want to tell you one more thing about Susan, because this story is not finished between us, and I don't want to leave you with a clean arc where the conflict has a beginning, middle, and tidy end. Real relationships don't have those, and this one is no different. In March of 2024, Susan had a health scare of her own. A lump in her left breast, discovered at a routine mammogram. The 2 weeks between the finding and the follow-up biopsy were 2 of the hardest weeks I have seen her go through, and I was close enough to see them clearly because I was still her father and she was still my daughter, and whatever had passed between us in the fall had not changed that fundamental fact. She called me the night she got the mammogram results. She said she was scared. She said she knew it was probably nothing. Statistically, it probably was nothing, but that she couldn't stop her mind from going to the dark place. She said she hadn't told David yet because she didn't want to worry him until she knew more, which was a decision I thought was unwise, but which I recognized as her right to make. I drove to Meadville that night. I sat with her in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had told me about the surgery, the same table, and I listened. I listened for a long time. I did not tell her what to do. I did not call her doctors or coordinate her care or make her appointments. I listened. And when she was done talking, I told her that I was scared too, and that I was going to be there throughout whatever happened, and that I loved her. I know how to do this now, I said. I know how to love you without managing you. She looked at me for a long moment. That's not something you usually know, she said. Most people don't. No, I said, most people don't. The biopsy came back clean. The lump was benign. The 2 weeks ended and we all breathed again. And in the breathing, something settled between Susan and me that had not been settled before. Not resolved. I don't think what happened between us is the kind of thing that resolves, but settled, adjusted to, held at the right distance for both of us to stand. I am going to tell you something that might surprise you, given everything I've just said. I am grateful for what happened. Not for the violation of my autonomy, I'm not grateful for that. Not for the careless notation, or the unanswered phone calls, or the morning I spent in my living room in the dark feeling subtracted from my own life. I'm not grateful for any of those specific things. But I'm grateful for what they forced me to become. Before all of this, I was doing what I think a lot of people do in the years after a major loss. I was managing, I was functional, I was maintaining, I was okay. And okay, when you're 73 and recently widowed and slightly lost, seems like enough. Okay seems like the reasonable goal. But I was not fully present in my own life. I was present for other people's versions of my life, Susan's version, and the doctor's version, and even Alina's version, however well-intentioned, but not quite my own. I had retreated from the demands of full selfhood. I had, without quite knowing it, started to accept the narrative that grief had delivered me to, the narrative that said I was diminished, that I needed handling, that my judgment was not quite as reliable as it used to be. I had started to believe the story other people were telling about me. The fight to get my autonomy back was also a fight to believe something else, to insist on my own reliability, to act as though my answers to questions about my own life were correct until proven otherwise, rather than to wait for someone else to validate them. To stand in my own kitchen and say, "This is mine, and you are welcome here, but you are a guest." This is something I understand in a different way than I understood it before. I used to teach it as history, the long, grinding work of claiming one's own story, the fight of every marginalized group to be the author of their own narrative rather than a character in someone else's. I taught it from the outside, admiringly, as something other people had done. Now I understand it from the inside, as something I had to do, personally, in my own small life, against an adversary no bigger or more intentional than a loving daughter's fear. The stakes were nothing like the historical stakes I taught. I'm not going to compare a scheduling conflict with my daughter to the civil rights movement. But the mechanism is the same, the refusal to accept someone else's definition of who you are and what you're capable of. The insistence that your story is yours to tell. I tell my story now. There are things I still don't know. I don't know exactly when Susan decided I couldn't be trusted with my own decisions. I don't know the precise moment when love became management. I have tried to identify it, and I can get close. The year after Patricia died, the fog, the particular conversation when I first backed down, but I can't put my finger on the exact turning point, and I suspect it doesn't have one. These things develop through accumulation, not through revelation. I don't know whether my knee will eventually need surgery. The physical therapy has been helping, but arthritis doesn't reverse itself, and Dr. Holloway has been honest with me that the trajectory of the condition means I will probably need to make a decision within the next 2 or 3 years. I'm not afraid of that decision now. I have the information I need to make it, and I trust myself to make it when the time is right, and I trust the doctors I've been rebuilding direct relationships with to give me what I need to make it well. I don't know whether I'll speak again in public forums, though I suspect I will. The conversation Dr. Holt's group is trying to have feels important, and I was always most useful in a room when I have something to say. I don't know what the future looks like specifically. I'm 74. The future is statistically shorter than the past, and this is not something I say with self-pity, but with something closer to clarity. Patricia's death taught me about the brevity of what's left in a way that nothing else could have. Every year after 60 is, as someone once told me, a gift that comes with a question mark. I receive it with both hands. What I know is this: I am the person who decides what happens to my body. I am the person who decides how I spend my time, whom I trust, what risks I take, what I'm willing to undergo and what I'm not. I am the primary authority on my own life, and I will remain that authority until the evidence genuinely indicates otherwise, not the thin evidence of one distracted afternoon, not the evidence of a daughter's fear, but real evidence, properly assessed, by people I've chosen to assess it. I am a person, not a patient, not a problem, not a project. A person. I want to end with something small. Last October, on what would have been Patricia's birthday, she would have been 76, I took myself to the Irish pub downtown that we used to go to for special occasions. It was a Thursday evening, a little early, and the place was quiet. I sat at the bar and had a Guinness and a bowl of the fish chowder that Patricia had loved, and I talked to the bartender, a young man named Pete who had no idea it was a significant day, and we talked about the baseball playoffs and the new road construction that had made downtown difficult, and a book Pete was reading for the first time that I had read years ago. It was a completely ordinary evening. I sat there alone at the bar of a quiet pub and ate good chowder and had a good conversation and felt, not happy exactly, but present, entirely present, not disappeared. On the way out, I stopped at the door and looked back at the bar for a moment, the amber light of the place, the quiet conversation, the ordinary beauty of it. And I thought, Patricia would have liked this. She would have liked knowing that I was here, sitting at a bar on her birthday, having an ordinary evening and not apologizing for it to anyone. She would have liked knowing that I was still here, still myself. That is the whole story. That is what I was fighting for. I know this has been very long. If you're still here, thank you. If any of this is familiar to you, if you've watched a parent be managed this way, or if you've been managed this way yourself, or if you work in a system that does this kind of managing without quite meaning to, I'm not here to blame you. I know how it happens. I know the good intentions that build these cages, bar by careful, loving bar. But I am asking you to ask the question. The question Elena asked me in September of 2023, standing in her kitchen, the question that hit me like sunlight after a long grey morning. What do you want? Ask the old person in your life that question. Ask it directly, without preamble, without managing the answer. Ask it and then wait. Give them the time they need. Let the answer be whatever it is, even if it's the wrong answer by your measure, even if it's the answer you were afraid of, even if it means they're going to do something you don't agree with. They are the person, you are not. Ask the question. My name is Kelly Dugan. I am 74 years old. I am a retired history teacher who lives alone in a small house in Pennsylvania with a bad knee and a garden that needs work and a pile of books on the nightstand and a membership to a woodworking class I'm still terrible at. And I am exactly who I say I am. Before I get to the edit, I want to go back and fill in some things I skipped over, because in telling the story straight, I realize I've left out a lot of the texture that actually matters. I've given you the shape of things, but not the weight of them. Let me try to give you the weight. When I talk about Patricia dying, I make it sound clean. A stroke, a Tuesday, gone. And that's the outline of it, that's the factual architecture, but the inside of it was nothing like clean, and I owe you the inside of it, because the inside is where Susan comes from. The inside is where all of it comes from. Patricia had her stroke on a Tuesday morning in September 2019. I was in the kitchen making coffee. She was upstairs. I heard a sound I can't describe precisely because there are no precise words for it. A sound that was wrong in a specific way, the way a single wrong note in a familiar piece of music is wrong, your body knows before your mind does. And I went upstairs, and she was on the floor beside the bed. I called 911. I was on the phone with the dispatcher for 11 minutes while we waited for the ambulance. The dispatcher was excellent. I remember her voice clearly even now, low, steady, a particular rhythm to it that kept me from catastrophizing in those 11 minutes. She told me what to do, and I did it, and she stayed on with me the whole time. I have thought many times about calling 911 back to tell the dispatcher she was exactly right, that she did exactly the right thing. I have never done it. I don't know why. The ambulance came and they took Patricia, and I followed in my car because that's what you do, you follow, and I remember the drive to the hospital as a kind of suspension of ordinary reality. The traffic seemed too normal, other cars going about their business, someone at a red light checking their phone, a woman with a dog on a leash. All of it so ordinary it was nearly unbearable. The world outside the windshield had no idea. She never regained consciousness. She died at 4:47 that afternoon, with me and Alina and Susan at her bedside. Marcus was flying in from Seattle, but hadn't made it yet. She died with Alina holding her right hand, and Susan holding her left, and me sitting beside her with my hand on her arm, which is a strange thing to have as your last physical memory of a person you spent 43 years with, that particular warmth of their arm under your palm, but it is what I have, and I have held it carefully since. I told all three of my children that afternoon, Alina in person, Marcus by phone, while he was still in the car from the airport, and I can still hear the quality of the silence on that call before he said anything. Susan was in the waiting room, outside the room where Patricia still was, and when I came out to tell her what she already knew, she grabbed me and held on with both arms and cried so hard that I ended up holding her up. This 55-year-old woman in the hospital corridor, my youngest child, still my child, and I held her together while my own grief. Well, you learn as a parent to put your grief aside for the immediate needs of the people around you. You do it without deciding to. It's automatic, the way breathing is automatic. You hold the other person together and your own grief waits in a room nearby, very quiet, until you're ready for it. I was not ready for it for a long time. The first weeks were organized chaos. There are so many things that have to be done when a person dies, the practical machinery of death, the certificates and accounts and phone calls and arrangements, the particular bureaucracy of grief that keeps you busy enough to avoid feeling the feeling fully. Alina managed most of this, which was both her gift and her way of grieving. Susan was there constantly, in and out of the house, cooking, cleaning, running errands, keeping me company. Marcus stayed for 2 weeks, a long time for Marcus, and then went back to Seattle with promises to call, which he kept. After everyone had gone home, and the casseroles had been eaten, and the sympathy cards had been stacked in a pile I couldn't quite bring myself to go through, I was alone in the house for the first time. That first night alone was one of the harder things I've lived through. Not dramatically hard, I wasn't in crisis, I wasn't dangerous, I was simply there in the house that had been our house for 40 years, breathing the air that still carried the faint, familiar smell of her, looking at the objects on the shelves that were her objects among my objects, and feeling the specific, physical weight of the absence. She had been there, and now she wasn't there, and the space she wasn't in was shaped exactly like her. I went to bed very early because I didn't know what else to do, and I lay in the dark for hours. This became a pattern that would last, in some form, for most of the next year. I would go to bed early because the evenings were the worst. That was when we used to talk, review the day, read in the same room, all the small comfortable intimacies of a long marriage that you don't even notice until they stop. And I would lie awake for hours, not quite sleeping, not quite thinking, in a state I came to think of as the fog's bedroom. Susan started coming over in the mornings. At first it was thoughtful, she'd drop by a few times a week, bring coffee, sit with me for an hour, I was glad of it. But by November it was every morning, without exception, and I hadn't asked for that, and I didn't know quite how to say that it was sometimes too much, because how do you tell your daughter who lost her mother that showing up for you is sometimes too much? You don't. You drink the coffee. David, her husband, told me later that this period was hard on their marriage, not in a way that created any permanent damage, he said, but in a way that made things tense. Susan was at my house every morning and often in the evenings too, and David was largely left to manage their own household while she managed mine. He had been understanding about it because he loved Susan and understood her grief, but it had stretched things. I learned this in the spring of 2024, sitting in Susan's backyard with David while Susan was inside making dinner, one of those early spring evenings that's still a little too cold, but you're outside anyway because you've been inside all winter and the ground smells like itself again. David had poured us both a drink and we were quiet for a while, and then he said, with the particular hesitance of a man who has been wanting to say something for a long time. She almost couldn't stop herself with the surgery thing, the managing. I know, I said. I tried to tell her. I told her in July that it had gone too far. She heard me, but she didn't quite believe me until you said it. Why did she believe me and not you? He thought about this. Because you were the one who could take your love back, he said finally. I couldn't threaten to love her less. That's not something I could do and mean it. But she was afraid you'd stop loving her. That gave it weight. This is a strange and sad thing about family. The ones who love us most securely sometimes have the least leverage to change our behavior because we know they're staying regardless. The ones whose love feels slightly conditional, whose disappointment we're still afraid of, those are the ones who can reach us. I told David that I didn't want Susan to be afraid I'd stop loving her. He said, I know, but she is anyway. She's afraid of everyone she loves leaving. After your wife, she never quite got back to. He stopped. He's not a man who talks easily about emotional things, and he'd already said more than came naturally to him. I know, I said, I know. We sat with the early spring air and the drinks, and the quiet and the dogs, somewhere inside the house making their evening sounds, and it occurred to me that David loved Susan the way I had loved Patricia, that steady, anchored, undramatic love that doesn't make headlines but gets you through everything, that is the actual substance of a life rather than the story you tell about it. And I felt something that was almost gratitude for him, for this quiet man who had been watching his wife become something she didn't want to be and had tried, in his quiet way, to say so. She's lucky to have you, I said. He looked slightly embarrassed, the way people do when sincerity lands directly. I'm lucky to have her, he said, even when she's like this, even when she makes it hard. That's love, I said. Yeah, he said, that's love. There is another dimension to this story that I have been circling around, and I'm going to say it directly now. My generation, people in their 70s, people who grew up in the post-war years, people who were formed by a particular set of cultural assumptions about what it meant to be a parent and a child. My generation is not especially well equipped for this particular fight. We were raised, many of us, to receive authority from our elders and then to provide it to our children, and we absorbed certain ideas about deference and respect that can work against us when the dynamic inverts, as it inevitably does. My father's generation did not talk about feelings. My father did not ask whether I was okay. He showed up. He worked. He sacrificed in ways that were practical and tangible, early mornings, long hours, 33 years in the same mill, and those were his love, those acts. And within that framework of love, there was very little space for the kind of explicit conversation about autonomy and needs and what you want and how you feel that is now understood to be necessary for healthy relationships. We didn't have those conversations. We just moved through the days and the decisions and accumulated a life. I was better at those conversations than my father was. I think teaching made me better at them, and Patricia made me better at them. She was not a woman who tolerated emotional avoidance, but I still had the deep grain of that formation in me. The part that thought showing vulnerability was weakness, that expressing needs was imposition, that accepting help was a kind of defeat. The part that would rather drink bad coffee from my daughter's insistently chosen pot than say I prefer my own. These are not virtues. They presented themselves as virtues, as dignity, as self-sufficiency, as the stoic endurance of a man who didn't make trouble, But what they actually were was avoidance. What they actually were was the habit of disappearing yourself before anyone else could do it. Susan had not created the dynamic she'd exploited. She had inherited it. I had been practicing not asking for things and not saying what I needed for a very long time. And when the grief came and the fog came and I needed help, the help took the form it did because the people offering it had learned from me that my preferences were negotiable. I think about this a great deal, the ways we teach our children to treat us without knowing we are teaching them, the ways our own habits of self-erasure become permission slips for others, the ways a lifetime of being quietly, steadfastly fine regardless of the truth leaves you without the vocabulary you need for the moment when you're not fine. I am working on the vocabulary. It is late life work, and it is uncomfortable, and I am doing it anyway, because the alternative is to stay quiet and get smaller and eventually, not necessarily in a dramatic medical way, not necessarily in any way anyone would identify as a crisis, to simply not be the main character of my own story anymore. I have been the main character of a great many things: my marriage, my classroom, my family, this particular ugly and clarifying passage of my 70s, and I intend to stay that. I want to tell you about Bill Terrence, because I've mentioned him several times, and he deserves more than mentions. Bill and I met in 1981 at a school board meeting. We were both new teachers in the district, both baffled by the particular theater of the public school board meeting, and we ended up sitting beside each other and whispering editorial comments behind our hands for 3 hours, and by the end of it we were friends. He taught chemistry. He was a terrible cook, but an extraordinary gardener. He had a laugh that was so specific and so identifiable you could pick it out across a crowded room. He had been married to a woman named Lorraine who died of cancer in 2021, 2 years after Patricia. Bill and I had been managing our widowhood in parallel without talking about it directly for 2 years before we actually talked about it. Men of our generation tend to manage things in parallel without talking about them directly. We would have lunch at the Pioneer and talk about current events and the school district's administrative decisions and the new construction on Route 8, and neither of us would say, "I wake up in the night reaching for someone who isn't there anymore." Neither of us would say, "Some days the house is so quiet it's loud." We finally talked about it, or rather, Bill finally started it, one Thursday lunch in January of 2023, about 3 months before everything with Susan came to a head. He'd been quieter than usual, moving his food around more than eating it, and finally he put down his fork and said, "Do you ever feel like a ghost?" I looked at him. "In your own life," he said, "like you're there but not officially there." I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be now," he said. "Lorraine, always, we always," he stopped. "I don't know how to want things," he said. "I used to want things, I don't know where that went." This was, I thought, one of the truest things anyone had said to me in years. "I think it goes with them," I said. "For a while, I think, when you love someone for a very long time, some of your wanting gets tied up with theirs. And when they go, some of your wanting goes with them." Bill looked at me. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's it." We sat for a while. "You'll get it back," I said. "Most of it." "Have you?" "Some of it," I said honestly, "more lately." The truth was that part of getting it back for me was the fight. The fight to reclaim my own medical decisions, the fight to name what Susan was doing and to stop it, the fight to sit in Dr. Holt's working group and be a person with something useful to contribute rather than a person being managed. Conflict, handled honestly, is clarifying. It forces you to figure out what you actually believe, what you actually want, what you're actually willing to stand up for. I had been so long without that kind of clarity. Bill's version of getting it back was gentler than mine. He had fewer external conflicts to spark it, but it was happening. He'd started volunteering at the public library, doing a science reading program for kids on Saturday mornings, which was such a perfect Bill Terrence thing that I felt something like joy when he told me. He'd planted a new bed of vegetables, an ambitious one, squash and tomatoes and peppers, the kind that required real commitment. He'd bought a canoe. "A canoe," I said. Lorraine always wanted to learn to paddle, he said. I always said we'd get around to it. He shrugged. I got around to it. There is something about the way people grieve forward, the way they pick up the thread of the things that didn't get done and carry them, transformed, into what's left, that I find deeply moving. It's not morbid. It's not sad, or not only sad. It's a kind of love that outlasts its original context and finds new ground to take root in. Bill paddles his canoe. I walk in the mornings the way Patricia walked. She always said the morning walk was when her head cleared. She was right. My head is clearest at 6:30 in the morning, moving through the quiet streets with the lights still grey and the birds starting and the world not yet fully committed to the day. On those mornings, I am most purely myself. There is a version of this story in which I am simply the wronged party, and I want to be careful about that version, because it's too simple, and simple stories have a way of calcifying into something false if you're not watchful. Susan was wrong. I've said so, and I mean it, and I don't walk that back. What she did, the surgery, the records, the systematic assumption of authority over my health care, was a violation of my autonomy, and the fact that it came from love doesn't unmake it. But I was not perfect either. I have been trying to be honest with myself about this, which is harder than being honest with other people about it. Being honest about what you did wrong is uncomfortable in a specific way, because it requires you to hold simultaneously the fact that you were wronged and the fact that you contributed to the conditions in which the wrong was possible. These two things are not contradictory. They are often how life works. I contributed by backing down repeatedly when I shouldn't have. I contributed by accepting Susan's tears as argument rather than as emotion, which is to say, by letting her emotional state become a reason not to hold a position, rather than acknowledging her emotion while maintaining the position. I contributed by failing to name the dynamic for years, letting it grow in the dark, which is what unnamed dynamics do. I contributed by not, in the months and years after Patricia died, giving my children explicit, clear information about my wishes for my health care. Not a healthcare proxy document. I had one, designating Elena, but a real conversation, a direct and specific conversation about what I wanted and what I did not want and why. I had not had that conversation. It's uncomfortable to have. It requires talking about mortality and diminishment and the possibility of incapacity, and I am a person who prefers to talk about other people's history than my own future. But the avoidance had consequences. After all of this was over, I had that conversation. I had it with all three of my children, not together but separately, because they needed to hear it in the format that would reach each of them. With Elena, it was organized and thorough, and we made a document. With Marcus, it was over video call, casual and direct, and he asked good questions and seemed relieved to have the information. With Susan, it was long and difficult and emotional, and she cried twice, and I held the position through the crying. And at the end of it, we were both exhausted, and something important had been said. I told them, here is what I want medically. Here is the threshold at which I would welcome your involvement. Here is how I would like that involvement to look. And here is what I am asking you never to do without my explicit consent. Susan said, during her version of this conversation, what if you can't tell us what you want? What if something happens and you can't speak for yourself? Then Elena is my proxy, I said, and you trust her to do what I would want. But what if? Susan, I said. She stopped. I have written it down, I said. You don't have to guess. You don't have to decide. I have made the document, and you don't have to carry that weight. She was quiet for a moment. Is it? Did you write down everything? Yes. Even the equipment, the extraordinary measures. Yes. She let out a long breath. I always worry that we'll make the wrong call, she said, that I'll make the wrong call, that whatever I decide won't be what you would have wanted. I know, I said, but you don't get to manage my living life in order to avoid the possibility of making a wrong call about my dying. Those are separate things. I know, she said, I know they are. We sat together for a while, the kitchen, the same table, always the same table. Mom would have known,